Hello, everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of Taboo Table Talk. I'm your host, Krish Mohan, and these are your pre-show announcements. Hey, if you want to support this show, one of the biggest things you can do is share this content out. This is usually stuff that isn't covered in mainstream media and is censored on a lot of the big tech platforms like YouTube, Facebook, Spotify, and that sort of stuff. So to get the word out there so more people can learn about these things, hitting that share button is a big thing you can do. If you want to financially support the show, you can make a one-time donation or become a sustaining member, making monthly donations over on my website at krishmohanhaha.com. It's KRISHMOHANHAHA.com. While you're there, you can grab my stand-up comedy albums as well, which are available for a pay-what-you-want platform. And you can also check out past episodes of this show and get tickets to my virtual and in-person shows that are coming up. Next Thursday, March 24th, I'm doing a virtual show where I am performing all new material that I'm working on, old material that I'm polishing up, changing, tweaking, that sort of stuff. The show is going to be at 8 p.m. Eastern and will run for about an hour, so you can grab your tickets for that show. That's March 24th, 8 p.m. Eastern over Zoom. I hope to see you guys there. I'm also going to be on the road in April for 10 days with my good friend Ron Placone from Get Your News On with Ron, and we are going to be on tour from April 16th through the 25th. We're going to be in Pittsburgh. We're going to be in Toronto. We're going to be in Ottawa, Montreal, Burlington, Portland, Maine, Boston, Massachusetts, and New York City. So grab your tickets either over on my website at krishmohanhaha.com or over at Ron's website at ronplacone.com. It would be really, really awesome to see you guys there. Come say hi. Come say that you're a listener of the podcast. You watch Forkful of Noodles. You've attended a virtual show or whatever it is. It's going to be great to see you guys out in the real world. I'm very excited for doing more in-person shows and maybe some weekend tours here and there. So keep an eye out for those. Right here on the pre-show announcements at Taboo Table Talk. And without any further ado, let's dive into this week's episode. Enjoy it, everybody. What is up, party people? What a weird way to start the podcast. Hi, everybody. This is Krish Mohan. Welcome to Taboo Table Talk. We have a fantastic guest, a guest that you may have heard in a recent episode, but with everything going on over in Ukraine, I wanted to have him back because he's one of the people that has been consistently covering Ukraine and what's been going on there, and so I wanted to welcome back Ben Norton to the show. Boy, guess what we talk about? We really get into some of the missing elements that corporate media is not covering about the Ukrainian crisis, which skews a lot of things and makes things more black and white. But that's because you're not getting the full truth, right? It's the most blatant view of lie of omission basically is what the media is doing, but it's far worse because it has far-reaching consequences, as we can see. Social media is saying that it's okay for hate speech and death threats towards Russians and Putin. I mean, this is a world leader that they're saying it's okay to openly talk about assassinating. I mean, what kind and that's because we believe that the coverage of the Ukrainian crisis should only be from the perspective that Russia is evil. So it's given us that carte blanche and a lot more. The deplatforming of RT is another big one that should be very, very disconcerting to a lot of people, whether you liked RT or not, whether the optics of RT America was not great or not. None of that really, to me, comes into play when the United States deplatformed and completely blacked out a journalistic institution, right? A journalistic company. RT America had a lot of journalists on it, not just comedian Lee Camp. Um, and that should be very, very scary to people that they are going to use this McCarthy. I mean, this is what McCarthyism is intended to do. You're kind of seeing it in its accelerated form, partly due to the fact that I think McCarthyism is coming to an end. People are pushing back on it. With this sort of an extreme, it's going to slow that timeline down, and that's sort of what um, desperate measures do. But anyway, all that is to say that these are the missing elements of the Ukrainian crisis, along with a large portion of history that we go into with Ben Norton today. This is obvious. You guys know it's pre-recorded, but we're going to talk about the NATO expansion. Why was NATO expanding? What was Russia's response to that? Back in 1990, back in 2008, back in 2014, what was Russia's response to that? And how the U.S. kind of counter responded. We're going to talk about what we just discussed a little bit of the increase in Russophobia that we're seeing. This new version of the Cold War, or this evolution of the Cold War, or rather devolution of the Cold War, and the actual Nazis that are inside the Ukrainian National Guard. The Ukrainian military, and these are things that the media used to talk about and no longer talks about. They've kind of reframed and rebranded these Nazis in the Guard, and so all of this stuff is important to talk about to understand the context, and really the conclusion that we can all arrive to, and that we can all agree upon, is that there are no good guys in this war. Very seldom, very, very, very seldom are there any good guys and bad guys in war. Anybody that wants to wage war in whatever fashion, or even provoke a war in whatever fashion, is not a good guy, and therefore should not be seen as one, right? There's a lot of complex things that are going on in the background that led to this, and it's not just as simple as, well, Putin's crazy and Putin's evil. I don't like the guy. I don't agree with his politics, and I think he's one of the most corrupt politicians on the planet. But I also don't agree with what the United States is doing and how the United States has decided to position themselves against Russia, and really kind of perpetuating the notion of enemy states and things like that. So. But that's enough of me kind of rambling on and on about it. I'm writing a pretty large piece about it that I'm hoping can come out rather soon. Hopefully it will. A lot of little details, links, and all that sort of stuff will be included, so it'll take a little bit of time for me to articulate all the thoughts that I'm trying to articulate a little bit better than I articulated them in this very rambly intro of mine. But without any further ado, let's dive into our conversation with Ben Norton from the independent news outlet Multipolarista. Enjoy it, everybody. So I want to start with this because I feel like this is an important question to understand and get just a better understanding of what's going on. Is how far back do we really need to go to understand what happened that led to Russia invading Ukraine?
Well, there are people trying to go back to the old Russian Tsarist Empire, going back hundreds of years. It's true that in the past, Kiev, which is now the capital of Ukraine, had been the capital of Russia. Not only part of Russia, it was the capital of Russia.
Oh
So,
wow.
I mean, there are people trying to go back that far, and that history is, of course, relevant. But we don't need to be experts on Russian ancient history to understand what's happening today. I think those details are important. The fact that Ukraine and Russia have this very interlinked history of Ukraine being part of the Tsarist Russian Empire leading up to today. But honestly, if you want to really understand the immediate roots of the conflict, I think the most important history is going back to 2014. And
Mm,
what happened in 2014? The United States organized a coup d'etat in Ukraine in which far right neo fascist groups played a key role as the violent muscle behind this coup. We have numerous pieces of evidence, including a leaked phone call that was likely recorded by Russian intelligence of the top US State Department official, Victoria Nuland, in which she handpicks who the leaders of the Ukrainian government will be after the US backed coup in 2014. And then the immediate years before that, in 2013, there was this democratically elected president named Viktor Yanukovych. He was corrupt. I mean, certainly not like some great leftist icon. I mean, he was a corrupt leader, but he politically had maintained a policy of neutrality, that Ukraine would neither ally with the West nor with Russia. And in 2013, he was actually trying to negotiate a trade deal with the European Union, but the
mm,
European Union which is a totally neoliberal institution, was trying to force Ukraine to impose all of these neoliberal structural adjustment programs that would be devastating for the Ukrainian economy. And he said, screw that. And Russia offered him a favorable economic agreement. So he went with Russia, which led to this movement called Euromaidan, which was a series of protests by these Western backed groups and US government funded NGOs that have been funded through the National Endowment for Democracy and all these CIA cutouts. And that escalated in late 2013 and early 2014. And then in February, there was this violent coup that overthrew the elected president Yanukovych and installed a Western puppet regime. Ironically, exactly what the West is accusing Russia of trying to do, installing a puppet regime in Ukraine. Well, they have experience doing that kind of thing. They did it in 2014. And then that created a civil war. And the civil war started in 2014 when Ukrainians who speak Russian, now they're not Russians, they are Ukrainians, but Ukrainian is a political identity and an ethnicity. But then it might be confusing, but there are Russian speaking Ukrainians in the eastern part of Ukraine. There are also Polish ethnic Ukrainians. There are also Ukrainians who are ethnic Poles. There are Ukrainians who are ethnic Hungarians, right? Just like there are, in the United States, there are tons of different ethnic groups, but then everyone's, if they have a passport or an ID, they're a US citizen.
right.
So in Ukraine, there was a very significant Russian minority that rose up after the 2014 US backed coup and declared independence, specifically in the Donbass, the eastern region, in the areas that they called the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. And they took up arms against the Kiev regime, which they considered to be an illegitimate Western puppet regime, and then the Ukrainian government, backed by the West, with billions of dollars of weapons from the United States and European countries and Canada, launched a war on the East. And that war has continued since 2014. So the war was not started by Russia. Russia definitely escalated the war by invading, but the war was not started by Russia. And the media acts as though this conflict began in February 24th when Russia sent its troops in. No, it began in February 2014 when the US organized this coup. And then there was fighting. There was a civil war that started in numerous cities. And that civil war has continued since 2014. And by the way, 14,000 Ukrainians have died. Well, let me rephrase that. 14,000 Ukrainians died between 2014 and the beginning of this year. That was before Russia invaded. So this was a pretty significant civil war going on that was fueled by the West with billions of dollars of weapons and NATO support. So those are all of the immediate details. And then, of course, there's also the details of NATO continuing to expand right up into Russia's borders, NATO's insistence that Ukraine and also Georgia are going to become part of NATO. NATO is not just a club of countries that just talk about how much they love each other. NATO is a military alliance led by the United States, and its goal is war with Russia. I mean, it's pretty explicit. So the fact that Ukraine, which has this massive thousands of miles of border with Russia, the fact that Ukraine was going to be part of NATO, and that NATO militaries, that is the US military, have been over the past several years repurposing Ukrainian military bases and providing them with Western military equipment, so they have so-called interoperability with Western militaries, which means basically they're integrated into Western militaries. All of this has been happening right on Russia's borders. Imagine, I mean, again, to explain to this situation to people, I often make this analogy. Imagine the United States organized a coup. Actually, excuse me. Imagine Russia organized a coup in Mexico, a coup d'etat, using violent fascist groups, and they overthrew the elected government of Mexico, which was corrupt, but whatever. Most governments in the world are corrupt, including the US government. And then they installed a Russian puppet regime in Mexico that was infiltrated by tons of violent fascist groups. And then they said that Mexico is going to join a Russian military alliance, and they're going to send Mexico billions of dollars of Russian weapons and Russian military advisors. What would the US response be? So that's
definitely military.
That's what Russia's situation is in. And yes, I mean, we can criticize Russia for invading. Honestly, I think it was a trap in many ways that the US and NATO were pushing Russia to do this. There's so much evidence showing that. They knew this would happen. So Russia can be criticized also because it actually, ironically, gave the biggest gift imaginable to Western imperialists, because NATO is now unified. Condoleezza Rice, this war criminal, architect of the Iraq War in the Bush administration, she was just on Fox News and hilariously criticized the Russian invasion of Ukraine as a war crime without a hint of irony. And she also said she thanked Putin for unifying NATO more than it's ever been unified. So ironically, I mean, this war has actually helped strengthen Western imperialism in a lot of ways, and it's invited these brutal Western sanctions on Russia. But we can't understand Russia's decision-making without understanding that, as even mainstream academics like John Mersheimer at the University of Chicago have admitted, it was the US, the European Union, and NATO that created this crisis, not Russia. And Russia certainly did escalate it by invading, but Russia did not create this crisis.
So that's one of the things I think that's missing from the corporate media, mainstream media dialogue, is the fact that NATO did escalate things. They did push Russia into it, and you're right. I felt the same way when I heard that he had invaded. I was like, well, you just fell right into the trap. You did exactly what they wanted you to do. They've been saying that he was going to invade for the entire month of February, and then, you know, all you're going to do is say that they got the date wrong, right? Like that's that's all the West has to claim. It's like those people that claim the apocalypse is coming every 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
And then
They said
they're
it was
just,
going to come in Y2K 2000, and it only came
yeah,
in 2023 with World War III and nuclear apocalypse. So they
right.
were only 23 years off.
They were off. That was the problem. They just had a date misinterpretation.
They forgot to carry a zero in their
Yeah.
calculation.
Yeah. But that is the thing, is how far back does that go? Because I know you wrote an article on Multipolarista that points back to 1997 and Biden making statements to the Atlantic Council saying that if NATO was to expand specifically into Ukraine, that what's the term? Russia will have
Have a vigorous and hostile reaction.
reaction. Yeah. So is that about as far back as we can track it, or do you feel like this goes far back as maybe even back to 1991?
Yeah, 1990. So we have so many pieces of evidence showing that Western governments, as part of NATO, promised the former Soviet Union in 1990 in multiple meetings that they would not expand NATO 1 inch east after the reunification of Germany in 1990. And this is something that Western governments have tried to rewrite, blatantly rewriting history. Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, has made comments recently saying this is a lie, that NATO never promised Russia not to expand. It's a blatant lie. That this fact is confirmed by documents published by the National Security Archive at George Washington University. It's confirmed by documents from the British National Archives. It's confirmed by documents from the government of Russia, the Russian Federation, that's own archives. There's minutes of these meetings showing that the United States and Britain and France and Germany all promised the former Soviet Union they would not expand NATO east, acknowledging that it was a security red line for Russia, that Poland, specifically, we have documents from the British National Archives, minutes of this meeting, in which Western diplomats admitted that Poland can never join NATO because it would be a security red line for Russia. And Poland joined NATO. And then we have these comments that you mentioned that I wrote about from Joe Biden in 1997, in which he says that the Baltic states, that is Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which had been part of the Soviet Union, that them joining NATO would provoke a vigorous and hostile reaction from Russia. They did join NATO in 2004. So we have so many examples of this. And then this leads up to 2008 at the Bucharest summit in Romania, in which NATO declared that Ukraine and Georgia, both of which were the country of Georgia, not the state of Georgia, that Ukraine and Georgia would join NATO. These are countries that are on the border of Russia. They were part of the Soviet Union. And especially with Ukraine, Ukraine is it's on such a geostrategic region of Russia, right on its southern flank. That's the area where Russia was invaded in multiple wars through Ukraine. When the Soviet Union was invaded by Nazi Germany in Operation Barbarossa in 1941, Nazi Germany invaded through Ukraine and then tried to carve off the southern part of Russia to try to detach the southern part of Russia from the northern part of Russia. This is a security red line for Russia. This is genuinely an existential threat to Russia. Any serious U.S. military strategist knows this. Any serious U.S. diplomat knows this. And, the attempts to compare this to the invasion of Iraq are ridiculous. Again, that doesn't mean that you can say that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a good idea necessarily. You can criticize it, but it is nothing in any way like the invasion of Iraq or Afghanistan or the war in Libya or the war in Yemen. No one with a brain cell, no one who is not high on whatever drugs NATO is selling, can seriously say that Iraq and Afghanistan pose an existential threat to the United States. First of all, Iraq is on the other side of the planet. Whereas Russia and Ukraine, this is a very unique, special situation in which NATO is right up on Russia's borders, threatening putting nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Let's not forget, the U.S. has nuclear weapons in numerous European countries, including Germany.
And has used them.
Yeah. Germany has U.S. nuclear weapons. Imagine the U.S. put nuclear weapons in Ukraine on Russia's border. Now, again, that doesn't mean that necessarily the invasion was a good idea, but the reality is that for Russia, this is an existential threat to its national security. Nothing at all like the U.S. destroying Libya, which had nothing to do with U.S. national security.
I do want to point out that the statement that you're making is contextualizing what's going on, rather, and context is not justification. And I know I shouldn't have to say that out loud to people that are listening, but because we're really not allowed to bring up NATO involvement and NATO escalation or U.S. coups or what the role of U.S. imperialism in this is. When you make that kind of a case, because of the culture surrounding this thing, which really reminds me of not just Cold War era stuff, but back in 2002, where you couldn't say anything about the U.S. military, it does frame it in this way, or people kind of frame it in this way of, oh, well, you're pro-Putin, which it's not. I think you can simultaneously say that you're against Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but you're also against NATO escalating this situation for exactly the reasons that you pointed out.
And it's also it shows such an infantile level of analysis that everything's about Putin. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of things I don't like about Putin. I mean, his politics are not my politics. He's not a leftist. He's an anti-communist. Like, and you can see this in the speech that he made when he announced the invasion of Ukraine. He criticized the Soviet Union policies, but the reality is that regardless of who is in charge of Russia, Russia as a country has national interests, right?
Mm-hmm.
And regardless of who is president in the United States, if Mexico had a coup organized by Russia, if Russia installed a puppet regime in Mexico and created a civil war in Mexico that spilled over into the US border, and Russia tried to add Mexico to its military alliance, it doesn't matter who the US president is. The US government would have national interests that would force it into a situation where it would have to take action in some way to stop this threat on its southern border. And the immigration flows that the US are responsible for are not an actual threat on the US southern border. You know, Republicans, these racists say that the US is being invaded on its southern border. That's absolutely absurd. No. Immigrants and refugees fleeing US wars and coups and neoliberal policies are not a threat. But Ukraine joining NATO and having nuclear weapons on Russia's borders is genuinely a threat, regardless of who's in charge. And yeah, okay, let's say Russia had a socialist government again. Let's say it wasn't Putin; it was a socialist. I mean, Russia would still face these existential threats. Honestly, they would probably be much greater if they had a socialist president, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So the point is that we have to be able to see this from the perspective not just of Russia, but from the perspective of any country that has its own national interests. Like, this is not a matter of even looking at it from the eyes of Putin himself.
Mm-hmm.
It's a matter of understanding that you can't just keep surrounding a country with foreign military bases and foreign troops. Here's another example. There are already 2 members of NATO who are directly on Russia's borders. And again, NATO is not just, people talk about NATO as if it's like some club of people who talk about how much they love democracy. No, NATO is a military alliance for war. And NATO was founded in 1949 by the United States as a coalition of countries that basically wanted a war with the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, the socialist countries. And one of the founding members of NATO was the fascist dictatorship of Portugal. It has nothing to do with democracy. The fascist dictatorship of Portugal was a founding member of NATO in 1949. So fast forwarding, the NATO supported fascists throughout the first Cold War in what was called Operation Gladio, in which these former Nazis and fascists, they were trained by NATO as paramilitaries and militias to wage war on the Soviet Union. And in the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, there were Nazi collaborators who were part of the German Nazi SS, who as part of the SS had to claim a loyalty oath to Adolf Hitler himself. They after the defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, became part of the Soviet Union, and they didn't drop their weapons. The CIA worked with these former Nazis to create militias to wage a guerrilla war against the Soviet Union in the Baltic states. And they created a militia called the Forest Brothers. And NATO, a few years ago, this isn't back then, a few years ago, in this decade, NATO created a documentary, a highly produced documentary film honoring the Forest Brothers, praising them. These were Nazi collaborators, but they were later supported by NATO. So NATO has a long history of supporting Nazi collaborators and fascists. And still today in Ukraine, NATO right now is arming Nazis, including the Azov battalion. And the point is that the Baltic states are members of NATO. And Estonia and Latvia are directly on Russia's borders. And in February, in the days leading up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Estonia was doing military exercises with British and French troops 100 kilometers from the Russian border. So imagine Mexico was doing military exercises with Russian and Chinese troops 100 kilometers from the US border. That's what they were doing. This is before Russia invaded Ukraine. So again, this doesn't mean that you necessarily think the Russian invasion was a good idea, but we have to understand that NATO was doing everything it could to push right up on Russia's borders.
I don't know how far the border of the United States to Russia is, but they were freaking out at those. Like Russia was doing military operations within its own borders, and the U.S. was like, "Oh, look at these troops." Meanwhile, I've toured this country for 10 years, and every single time that I was on the road, I at least saw 2 military convoys constantly moving up and down the highway. Right? It's like, yeah, they're doing military demonstrations within their borders. Guess what? So does America. Do you guys like the Blue Angels? Like, you
Well,
know,
the U.S. recently has been doing a lot of military exercises near Taiwan and in the South China Sea. And then when China responds by doing military exercises with Russia and Iran in the Indian Ocean, then the U.S. says this is provocation, and even though it's on the other side of the planet. So
Taiwan, which Dwight D. Eisenhower wanted to nuke in order to
and
pressure China.
And by the way, speaking of Ukraine and nuclear weapons, I mean, this really is like Russia's Taiwan. Of course, there are similarities and there are differences. It's not exactly the same situation. The difference is that Taiwan is part of China, but let's not forget, Taiwan was colonized, and Taiwan actually had a U.S. military base on it with nuclear weapons right up until the 1970s. So the U.S. You mentioned that, by the way, you said that Eisenhower wanted to nuke Taiwan. They actually wanted to nuke mainland China with nuclear weapons that were stored on Taiwan.
Yikes! Oh, that's that's the clarification.
Taiwan had a U.S. military base with nuclear weapons up until the 1970s.
Oof.
And then when the U.S. allied with China against the Soviet Union after the Sino-Soviet split, and Richard Nixon went to China in 1972, the U.S. agreed to recognize the one China policy, which recognizes there is only one China and that Taiwan is part of China. The U.S. still actually claims to recognize that on paper, but in reality, it actually is trying to push for Taiwanese secession from China and is sending troops and military advisors to Taiwan. But again, the point is that up until the 1970s, the U.S. had nuclear weapons in Taiwan, just kilometers away, minutes away from mainland China. And that's what the U.S. wants to do with Ukraine.
Absurd. I will say, though, I have heard that if you join NATO, you do get a tote bag. So that's pretty cool, I think.
And you get a free kill.
You get a
kill
free
anyone you want, and they'll no consequences.
Real quick kill, no big deal.
Chris, one other quick point here.
Yeah.
Trump bears responsibility for this, even though this, like, the liberal Russiagate obsession tried to portray Trump as like this Putin lover. He was gay with Putin, all this ridiculous nonsense. But the reality is that Trump took a lot of actions that escalated the conflict with Russia and really hurt U.S.-Russia relations. And that was one of those things, was withdrawing from the INF Treaty, which is a missile treaty that basically it prevented medium-range interballistic missiles from being put in Europe with nuclear weapons. So by withdrawing from the INF Treaty, which is a very important treaty that the Reagan administration had negotiated with the former Soviet Union and later the Russian Federation, that made it possible for nuclear weapons to be put in Ukraine. So when Russia is worried about nuclear weapons being put in Ukraine, that is not just like some crazy pie-in-the-sky possibility. We can thank Donald Trump, who supposedly was beholden to Putin. We can thank him for making that a possibility.
That guy just never leaves. You brought up the Azov Battalion. This is something that I think has gotten some brief mention in the mainstream, but anytime somebody kind of talks about any of these battalions from Ukraine, it's kind of under the monolith of freedom fighters. That's kind of how they're talked about. The Azov Battalion are neo-Nazis, and they're basically like a militia, right? I think my housemate was asking me about it, and kind of the equivalency that he said is, oh, so they're basically like the Proud Boys that are funded by the U.S. government. Would that be like an accurate representation, or is that boiling?
Yes,
it down
but
too
way
much?
worse. Even worse than that. Way worse. I mean, a few things to talk about here. First of all, Azov used to be called the Azov Battalion, but after the U.S.-backed coup in 2014, I mentioned, in which Azov and other neo-Nazis played a key role as the violence behind the coup, overthrowing the elected government. After that coup, Azov, the battalion, was directly incorporated into the Ukrainian state. and became part of the Ukrainian National Guard. So it changed the name to the Azov Regiment or the Azov Detachment. And Azov specifically oversees special operations for the Ukrainian National Guard. And by the way, operators, as they're called, special operations guys, they're like the main base for fascism around the world. Like a lot of Trump guys were operators, special operation guys. These are like the fascist white supremacists who like they create coffee companies that are like about like how much they hate Muslims and all this stuff. And they all create like these bullets that are like they have like pig fat around the bullets, right? Have you heard of
Yep.
this? There's like these US like boutique artisanal weapons companies run by these former special operations fascists who all love Trump, and they create like these bullets that are encased in lard. And by the way, that is exactly what these Azov Nazis in the Ukrainian National Guard are doing. The Ukrainian National Guard posted a video on its official verified Twitter account with the blue check mark, in which the Ukrainian National Guard boasted of these Nazis in the Azov regiment. There's a video they posted of this Ukrainian Nazi in the National Guard taking these bullets and covering them in lard and pig fat to kill Russian Muslims, and they referred to them as orcs. They referred to the Russian Muslims, the Ukrainian National Guard, and its verified Twitter account referred to Russian Muslims as orcs. And specifically, they were talking about Chechens. Chechnya is part of the Russian Federation, and they're a Muslim majority part of Russia, and they have part of the Russian military, and they've been fighting in Ukraine. So they're literal Nazis. They don't hide the fact that they're Nazis. They use the German Wolfsangel, which is an old symbol used by the original German Nazis in the 1930s and 40s. They use a repurposed German Wolfsangel, Azov does, and Azov also uses a white supremacist symbol known as the Black Sun, which is this neo-Nazi symbol used by the Germans as well, and it's a symbol of white supremacy. So what is the ideology of Azov? Their ideology is that Russians are not white, that Russians are actually descendants of the Mongols, of Genghis Khan and the Golden Horde, and that Russians are Asiatic, and that Ukrainians are a pure white race on the front lines against the Asiatic hordes, and that Azov and the neo-Nazis have to defend the white race from the Asiatic Russians. And Azov is part of the Ukrainian National Guard, has received weapons from the US, has received weapons from NATO, and has received training from the US and also the Canadian militaries. There are photos of US and Canadian military officers meeting with members of Azov with the Nazi patch they have on their uniforms. There's photos that Azov itself posted on its official website.
Oof.
And liberal Canada, not just the US, not just America, also Canada. The liberal Trudeau regime in Canada has supported these Ukrainian Nazis too.
So it's like the Ukrainian nationalist movement is completely tied to this notion of white supremacy, or is tied to white supremacy, because that's exactly what these guys are talking about.
Well, and it goes back to the Holocaust. So in the 1930s, there were Ukrainian fascists, and in 40s, of course, there were Ukrainian fascists, including groups called there are numerous groups, but one of them was called the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the OUN, and there were two factions, and the explicitly fascist pro-Nazi faction, the OUNB, was led by a Ukrainian Nazi collaborator named Stepan Bandera. And you can see photos of him all over. Ever since the 2014 coup backed by the US and Ukraine, Stepan Bandera has become like the national figure openly honored by the Ukrainian government in Kiev. And Stepan Bandera was a Nazi collaborator who praised Adolf Hitler and oversaw massacres of Jews and Poles and communists inside Ukraine. And he is now like the patron saint. You see him all over, portraits of him all over in rallies and marches in Ukraine. You see him in government offices. You see the portrait of this Nazi collaborator. And their analysis also was that, the German Nazis said that Russians are not white, but we'll make an exception for Ukrainians, even though they're Slavic. But the reality is that all these Ukrainians collaborated with Nazi Germany. But honestly, if the Nazis had won the war, they probably would have exterminated the Ukrainians too. But during World War II, they made an exception, and in Nazi Germany allied with Ukrainians against the Soviet Union. Well, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, right? But
Mhm.
they allied with some Ukrainians against the Soviet Union, including Ukrainian communists, but also in general, the Red Army included a lot of Ukrainians. So people talk about how in World War II, 27 million Soviets died defeating Nazi Germany. It was the Soviet Union that was responsible for 3/4 of Nazi casualties in World War II. And almost all of the fighting in World War II until 1943, almost all of it was on the Eastern Front. So the Soviet Union, as Winston Churchill, the inveterate racist, colonialist, anti-communist conservative, Winston Churchill admitted in a speech that it was the Red Army that tore the guts out of the Nazi regime, is the language he said. And by the way, Ukrainians bear a role. Russia often takes credit for it, and Russia deserves most of the credit because around 3/4 of the Soviets who died, which is 27 million, so almost 20 million Russians, or almost 20 million Russians died in World War II. But
Mhm.
also, about 15% of the Soviets who died in World War II fighting against the Nazis were Ukrainians. So Ukraine was divided internally, and there were a lot of Ukrainians who allied with Nazi Germany. And those are the Ukrainians who are seen as national heroes today and who are praised by the Ukrainian government and by NATO.
Wow. That is that never ceases to amaze me. How much the US will just side with neo-Nazis and fund them, but that goes back to to kind of the way that I think America is so conditioned by McCarthyism and so conditioned from this Cold War era uh, politics. I don't e- I hesitate to call it politics because I feel like it's bigger than that. It's this mentality that's there that if it's Russian or vaguely communist, it's okay to side with outright fascists, with outright white supremacists to combat this so-called bigger threat, right? And then it becomes the competition. Like to me, and correct me if you feel like I'm wrong, but to me, the argument in our current media, in corporate media and sort of just like the mainstream, is boiling down to who is the lesser of two imperialist evils, right? It's kind of the thing that we hear between Democrats and Republicans when it comes to every election. Is Russian imperialism bad or is US imperialism worse?
Yeah,
And I
well,
feel like
I would actually problematize even that. Like Russia's not
Mhm.
an imperialist power. Imperialism is a
Okay.
system. That doesn't mean that I mean Russia's a capitalist country. Russia has a capitalist government and has since 1991. But that's different from being imperialist.
Okay.
Imperialism is a system. It's not just a set of policies. You can criticize the Russian invasion, but this is like when Russia intervened militarily in Syria, people claim that it was imperialist, even though Russia was intervening at the request of the sovereign Syrian government. Or this is like people who say
Okay.
that Iran is imperialist. That's absurd. No, you can criticize the Russian and Iranian governments and disagree, but imperialism is a political and economic system, and within that system, Russia is not. I mean, Russia is actually a pretty weak power, especially economically, and Russia is defending its existence as a country.
Mhm.
And this is an actual. It's not an exaggeration. Again, like I said, no one with a brain cell would claim that Iraq was an existential threat to the U.S. But the reality is that the existence of Russia as a contiguous country is actually not a very secure possibility. Like there is a very real possibility in the upcoming decades that Russia could cease to exist as the country it is now, that could be broken up. And
Mm.
we've seen numerous US government officials openly talk about that. So, for instance, Brzezinski, the imperial planner, former national security advisor for Jimmy Carter, he published an article in 1997 in Foreign Affairs magazine in which he called openly for dividing up Russia into three different countries, including a European Russia, a Mongolian Russia, and a European Russia, a Siberian Russia, and a Far Eastern Russia, is what he said. So creating three new countries. This is exactly what the US did, what NATO did to Yugoslavia. which no longer exists as a country, or Czechoslovakia, which no longer exists as a country. The point is that, yeah, you can criticize Russia's actions, but Russia is not invading Ukraine to steal its natural resources, to exploit its labor, to export Russian capital into Ukraine, to exploit Ukrainian markets. Like, Russia is genuinely doing this out of desperation. And yes, it was a kind of desperate and crazy decision that you can criticize, but it's not fundamentally about exploiting Ukrainian markets. Like, it's not the kind of wars that imperialist powers do. This is the kind of wars that mid-level regional powers do when they face threats to their security. And yeah, it's a capitalist power, but the reality is, if you look at it from something called world systems theory, right, which is Emmanuel Wallerstein, these scholars who do a kind of scientific analysis of trade flows and exports and imports, Russia is considered a semi-peripheral country. So it's not the periphery, it's not like a third world country, but it's not part of the imperial core. Russia it's up there with the BRICS countries, the BRICS system, which was created as an attempt to try to create an alternative to US hegemony. And it stands for BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So the fact that the Russian economy is being put on the same level as the Brazilian and India and Chinese and South African economy shows that this is not a major imperial power. The Russian economy, in terms of GDP, is the 11th largest in the world. It's smaller than the Italian economy. It's smaller than the South Korean economy. And I don't think anyone would seriously call South Korea an imperialist power. So yes, Russia is a major regional power, and it's an inspiring global power. But we have to understand that imperialism is a system led by the United States, by NATO, by the World Bank, by the IMF, by the World Trade Organization. And yes, Russia as a capitalist power is trying to expand its political influence and economic influence, but it's fundamentally different from an imperialist war. That's why we have to it's not an inter-imperialist war. This is a desperate war of a country that has been surrounded by imperialism and is trying to survive. And yeah, obviously I'm not a huge fan of the Russian government, but it's not in any way comparable to what the US and Britain and France do.
Thank you for that clarification, because that's been kind of one of the arguments that I've been trying to not decipher, but just like clear up, because it all seemed so. Again, I think everybody's kind of just looking at this through like a U.S. nationalist perspective, and I think that like context like this is completely missing from our discourse. I want to ask you one last question, which is about the sanctions that the U.S. put on Russia and what the effect of that. I think it's become very clear that the people of Russia, whether they are for or against the invasion, are going to be the people punished for this. But I feel like the effects of the sanction go beyond all of that.
Yeah, I mean, the US and the European Union are waging a full-scale economic war on Russia, period. Not the Russian government, not the Kremlin, not Putin himself, on Russia as a country, the entire economy, and over 100 million Russians, right? So when the US invaded Iraq and Afghanistan and waged war on Yemen and Syria and Libya, and by the way, the war in Yemen is still ongoing. According to the United Nations, 377,000 Yemenis have died. Saudi Arabia continues to bomb hospitals and schools and buses and prisons with U.S. Raytheon bombs and killing hundreds of people, civilians, and it gets no coverage. And
can I make one quick addition to that? That is about 40,000 more deaths in Yemen than that was reported in January of 2022. Because I think the last number I saw was in January, and it was 336,000, and now it's up to so that's 40,000 in the span of 2 months. That's insane.
Well, the United Nations estimated that by the end of 2021, and we're in 2022, there would be 377,000 deaths in Yemen.
They weren't that far off.
Yeah. So anyway,
to continue. Yeah.
Anyway, the U.S. was never punished. The people of the U.S. economically, and the U.S. was never punished economically for those wars. No one imposed sanctions on the U.S. No one blocked U.S. banks. The U.S. and the European Union are not only blocking Russian exports and preventing purchase of Russian oil, which is going to hurt the Russian economy. They're imposing sanctions on Russian banks. They're removing Russian banks from the SWIFT system, and they're intentionally. The SWIFT system is a system for financial payments, which basically makes it almost impossible for Russian banks to do payments because it's controlled by. Again, this is imperialism. Imperialism is a system this is why Russia can be kicked out of the imperialist system. The US cannot be kicked out of the system because it controls the system. So the US can just overnight, basically, in a few days, the US and the European Union can just kick Russia out of the international financial system. That is imperialism. You can criticize Russia, but Russia is not part of that imperial system. It was just kicked out of it. And that's why socialist governments in the global south actually have been allying with Russia against NATO. Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, Bolivia, Vietnam, China, the DPRK, they've been siding with Russia against NATO here. Also, many other countries in the global south, including Eritrea, Zimbabwe, Sudan. I mean, anyway, the point is that Russia was just kicked out of the international financial system, and this is doing serious economic damage to the people of Russia. And now Visa and MasterCard announced that they're suspending most operations in Russia. So a lot of people in Russia can't use Visa and MasterCard. And also, even the most important thing we should keep in mind, the most destructive damage being done, is that the US admitted openly that it's trying to devalue the Russian currency, the ruble, trying to destroy Russia's currency, which bankrupts all of the savings of Russians, of average working Russians. Any money they have in their bank accounts, unless they're rich, the majority of Russians have their money held in rubles. They don't have dollars. They don't have euros. So that means that if you spent years of your life working hard in Russia, saving your money in rubles, saving your paychecks to buy a house or a car or whatever, now your money is becoming more and more worthless. We can't imagine that in the United States because the dollar is the de facto global reserve currency. So if you save up your money to buy a car or a house or whatever, your money doesn't really get devalued. There is some inflation, and inflation is becoming an issue, but it's not nearly at the level in Russia. So the US and European Union are bankrupting Russians to make an example, to punish them. And they admitted that their goal is to try to make life hard for average Russians, so they rise up against the Russian government. I mean, this is collective punishment of millions of Russians. This is an economic war on the Russian people.
And just lastly, I know that EU nations are also kind of facing the backlash of this because they get fuel from Russia, and now, this is kind of affecting the trade of all that. What is, for the last I heard, and again, please do correct me if I'm wrong, France and Germany are the two that are kind of facing the brunt of this issue in terms of getting fuel supplies and everything.
Yeah, unfortunately, I got to wrap it up. And in 1 minute here, I'll briefly say that the European Union is not the majority, but the plurality of its oil and gas comes from Russia. That means that until this week, Russia was responsible more than any other country. It was the largest exporter of oil and natural gas to the European Union, which relies on energy imports. There is not a lot of energy inside the European Union itself. And that was much cheaper, by the way. One of the reasons that energy prices have skyrocketed so much is because of this crisis in Ukraine, because these European countries stopped their long-term deals with Russia, in which they agreed to buy Russian oil and gas at a very low price, at a steady price over 10 or 20 years. Instead, they started buying oil and gas on the spot market, which means that it fluctuates depending on the invisible hand, the great free market, which meant that oil and gas prices have skyrocketed to levels never seen in decades. And now these prices are going to continue to skyrocket because they said they're not going to import Russian oil, and they might not import Russian gas. So this is going to cause a massive crisis that is going to devastate not only the people of Europe, who have to pay more and more in their energy bills, but also European industry, because European companies, small businesses, and even big industries, they have to pay energy bills as well to run their businesses and their shops and their factories. And they now are going to have to pay insane bills. But you know who benefits is the United States, because the U.S. has become the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas during this crisis because it's increased its exports of gas to Europe, which again shows that Europe hurts from this, the people of Russia hurt from this, and the U.S. gains.
Ben, thank you so much.
U.S.
This was
corporations gain, not the people. The U.S. corporations gain. Exxon, Shell, all the big corporations, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, they gain.
Of course, which is always the play in war, isn't it? Seriously, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate your a wealth of knowledge. Where can people read everything that you're publishing, and how can people support independent journalists who are a much needed voice, especially right now?
Well, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure. People can find me at my new website, which is multipolarista.com, and it's a bilingual website, and I have a lot of stuff in Spanish and English, mostly English, but a lot of stuff in Spanish too. And you can find me on all of the social media platforms there, and you can find me on Twitter at Benjamin Norton. So, Chris, thanks so much. This was a pleasure. Keep up the awesome work. And I got to say, I love your beanie. I don't know if it's
Thanks.
a reference to the band. You know the band, See You Space Cowboy?
No, it's a
Oh.
Cowboy Bebop reference.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
that's why I wasn't sure, but because I've never watched Cowboy Bebop, but I know the band got their name from Cowboy Bebop. But it's an amazing band. It's like a mathcore band. They do like really crazy, chaotic
No
hardcore.
way.
You should check them out. They're really good.
I'm definitely gonna check them out. Yeah.
Cool
Thank you so
lyrics
much,
too.
Ben. I appreciate
Great.
it.
Thanks
I
so
will
much.
talk to you soon. Yep.
Talk soon.
Kablamo, everybody. That is our conversation with the wonderful Ben Norton. You can check out his work on Multipolarista, the independent news outlet that he runs over at Multipolarista on Twitter and multipolarista.com. Subscribe to the newsletter. And keep up to date with everything that Ben is doing. And you can follow him personally on Twitter at Benjamin Norton. Posts really great stuff. And like I said, he covers stories that aren't being talked about in our corporate media, are not being addressed in mainstream conversation and discourse. And when you're kind of missing a very important element of the story, which includes the country that you currently reside in or call your nationality or whatever, right? When it's that country doing it, and then that same country is hiding that stuff, that should make you question some things about the truth about the situation, and listening to some of these more independent, better vetted and better sourced sources, because corporate media is not news. It's not journalism. They don't follow the ethics of journalism. They're infotainment at best, and calling them info is a bit of an insult to information. But when you go to someone like Ben Norton, when you go to the other shows that Ben has been on, such as the Socialist Program, such as the Project Censored radio show, the Mint Press News podcast, Mintcast, Redacted VIP with Lee Camp, RIP. When he's on these programs, these are also people that you can follow, because again, these people aren't supported by corporations. Raytheon isn't advertising on their network as they talk about expanding military operations and why we need to increase the military budget for the umpteenth fucking time. Meanwhile, people don't have homes, people don't have health care, bread lines are forming, and when mutual aid shows up, everybody shits on mutual aids. Or they don't talk about them, or they ignore them, and they lose funding, or they get absorbed by these charity industrial complex people. Like, these conversations are very important to be had, and you can't have them when corporate media kind of controls the discourse, and when they control the discourse, it leans in a very particular direction. The information that myself and Ben and all these other people that I brought up in this what is probably to be a long-winded outro, when we bring them up, they're not pleasant. We don't We don't want this shit to be true either, but they are, and we have to accept them for that. We have to accept that in this war and any other war, virtually any other war, right? Very, very seldom are there quote necessary wars, I guess. Very, very seldom. But there are no good guys in this, especially if you look at it in the perspective of helping the citizens, the average people of that country that are just trying to live their lives just like you or me. If you're more on their side, and let's be honest, you do have more in common with them than anybody in the upper echelons of any fucking government. That's just a good old fashioned fact. If we're coming at it from that perspective, then there are no good guys in this situation. This is nation states and people putting their dicks on the table and saying mine's bigger and no, mine's bigger, and what does that have to do with you trying to keep a roof over your head and feeding your children? Not a good goddamn thing. It's more about them not being able to deal with their tiny dicks. And why is that our problem? It shouldn't be, right? So again, if that's sort of the perspective that we're looking at it from, if you want to look at it from a humanitarian perspective, you can't ignore NATO escalation. You can't ignore NATO expansionism. You can't ignore the McCarthyist Russophobia that is erasing critical thinking in our society. You can't ignore the Nazis in the Ukrainian National Guard. So as people want to sit there and say rah rah to the Ukrainian military, again, it's like a lot of those people are Nazis. They don't like the Russians. They're using lard fat on their bullets to kill the Russian Jews and Muslims. Is like that's who you're supporting? I mean, now there's reports. I just watched a Richard Medhurst video yesterday because Ukraine has kind of had done an open call. Al Qaeda showed up. That's whose side we're on. There's no sides to pick in this, except for all of the parties to kind of swallow their pride, and at this point, NATO has to back down and Ukraine has to remain neutral. That is a must. That is a must. And if you can't see that kind of perspective, all you're going to do is escalate tensions and escalate tensions. If the Russophobia and the sanctions and the blatant censorship would have stopped this war, then it would have stopped by now. It hasn't, because these tactics don't work. They've never worked, so why keep trying them over and over again? Anyway, I mean anyway, I could keep going, but I'm not going to keep babbling on and on about this. Like I said, I am writing a pretty large piece about it. So I've been processing a lot of the way that I feel about this and kind of reflecting on sort of the personal aspect of how it's affected personal relationships or not affected personal relationships. Really, I consider myself lucky to have the close inner circle that I do. But anyway, that piece will come out hopefully soon. I'm going to keep polishing it up and making sure that it's saying what I want to say with the information that I have, and we'll see where it goes from there. So, but anyway, go check out Multipolarista, you guys. Go check out and support independent journalism. If you want to support this show and if you want to contribute financially to the show as well, you can do so over on my website at krishmohanhaha.com, KRISHMOHANHAHA.com. You can check out the donate tab. I will be updating that page with a little bit more of a accurate statement of transparency that with everything that's kind of changed in my life. My goals have shifted a little bit in terms of what I want to do with content and all that sort of stuff. So Yeah, so go and check that out. You can check out my albums there and grab your tickets to come to see that virtual show. You can literally be anywhere in the world and come check out that show as long as it's like not 2 o'clock in the morning and you're in where you're at. And if it is, I'm sorry. I don't control the passage of time, but boy, do I wish I did. Anyway, um, 8 p.m. Eastern next Thursday, March 24th, 8 p.m. Eastern. I am going to be doing a virtual comedy show, and I'll be talking about a bunch of stuff. Some sociopolitical, some personal things, that kind of stuff. Working on new material, so like unheard material, stuff that's not on an album or stuff that I haven't done in other shows and stuff like that. So, if you're free and if you want to come down, tickets are only $5, and they're available directly on my website. The link is there, yeah. Come hang out. It'll be a super fun time. But with all that said and done, I feel like this outro has been long enough. Uh, I will let you guys enjoy the rest of your day. As always, be good to yourselves, be good to each other, and stay taboo, everybody. See you later.